You're listening to the Longer Haul Youth Ministry Podcast with Jody Livingston, episode number 8. Let's do this.
Welcome to the Longer Haul Youth Ministry Podcast, helping you survive and thrive in youth ministry. And now your host, Jody Livingston.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the show. Thanks for listening today, wherever you are and wherever this finds you. Thanks for tuning in. If this is your first time listening, thanks for coming over and listening. And if you are coming back, well, thanks for coming back. If you're enjoying the podcast, you find the podcast helpful, please share it with other youth pastors, youth workers that you know, or other folks that would enjoy it and find it useful. And especially head over to iTunes and subscribe there to the podcast. Write and leave a review for the podcast. That is so helpful for me, just encouraging for me to see and read those and that. It also helps other youth pastors and youth workers find the podcast. And so that's helpful. Thanks so much for the folks who've already done that and gone over there and left those reviews. I really appreciate it more than I can tell you. And so if you have time, please consider doing that for me. I would appreciate it. You can also catch me on Twitter at Jody Livingston, Jody Livingston, and of course the Longer Haul on Facebook and at thelongerhaul.com. All of the links and resources mentioned in today's episode will be in the show notes at thelongerhaul.com/episode 008, thelongerhaul.com/episode 008. And so head over there after the show for all of those goodies. Our guest today on the show is Aaron Helman from smarteryouthministry.com. If you're not familiar with his blog or have not seen any of his stuff, I would highly recommend it to you. It's really, really good, very useful, very helpful for youth pastors and youth workers. He does a lot there with time management, just how to manage your ministry smarter and better so that you don't burn out, that you can stay in youth ministry over the longer haul, make a deeper, better, broader influence in the students and families that you serve. So definitely head over there and check it out. We're going to talk today about an issue that we're all facing in youth ministry and student ministry, and that is this issue and idea that we are seeing of students being so overcommitted, so busy, parents and families just running at both ends. And so we're going to talk about that. How do we address that? How do we approach that? What are the right and wrong ways to do that? And of course, at the end of the episode, Aaron's going to give a resource for you that he'd recommend for us. And so you want to make sure you stick around to the end of the episode to hear that. And with that said, we'll jump right in here to the interview with Aaron Helman from smarteryouthministry.com. Hey, Aaron, thanks for coming on the show, man. I appreciate you taking the time to do this. I know you and I have tried to do this a few times, and just schedule has kind of kept us from sitting down and talking. So I appreciate you taking the time to do it today.
Hey, I am excited to be here. It is winter in northern Indiana, which is not the most exciting time or place, but I'm happy to talk to you.
Yeah, we're down here in the metro Atlanta area, and it's cold. Not quite as cold as you, I'm sure. It's cold, but we've got family in Montana, and it was 51 degrees there yesterday, which seems a little backwards.
Yeah, I will start driving to Montana immediately.
Yeah, it's cold with no snow here. So it's just cold for no reason.
Right.
Which is awful. So for those listening who may not know you, may not be familiar with your blog over at smarteryouthministry.com, why don't you just take a minute, introduce yourself, a little bit about your journey to youth ministry, why the blog, and then we'll jump in from there.
Sure. Well, here's the story, the quick version of the story that I tell. I started in youth ministry as a 20-year-old college student, part-time. Ended up graduating from school with a business degree, and have been doing youth ministry for the last 12 years now. And the interesting thing, when I was in school, they had launched a youth ministry program, and they recruited me pretty heavy to join the youth ministry program. But at that point, I was already 2 years into school. I was on track to graduate in 4 years. And if I changed my major, it was going to be like a 5.5 year proposition. I really didn't want to do that. So I ended up not joining the youth ministry program, and I got the business degree instead of a youth ministry degree. But I stayed very close to the people who were in the youth ministry program. And so we all graduated, within 6 months or a year of one another. And we all were in youth ministry. We're all working youth ministry jobs. And I remember meeting with everyone just one day, talking and catching up and talking about ministry. And within 18 months, so a year and a half after that date, I was the only one of us who was still doing youth ministry.
Wow.
So the 6 of my friends who got a youth ministry degree were out of youth ministry. Mostly they were out of the church. They were done with the church. They had sworn off the church. And I, with my business degree, was still plugging along. And that always made me curious. What made me different? And as I got older and gained some experience and started to talk with more youth workers, I realized that the reason that I was able to make it through my first few years in youth ministry and that other people weren't was because of the skills that I'd learned getting a business degree, things like managing budgets or managing volunteers or communication, things that aren't necessarily emphasized as much in a typical youth ministry education. And so, I've always said, like, if you are not the best at speaking with teens or leading a small group, the church will have a lot of grace and you can learn those skills over the course of a year or two. But if you screw up your budget, you're gone almost immediately. And so I learned how to do those things. And people who kind of have that traditional youth ministry education, I sometimes think that's missing. And so I started Smarter Youth Ministry, smarteryouthministry.com about 4 or 5 years ago now. I actually don't remember. I don't really know what year it is now, but I started that because I realized that I had these skills and this knowledge that I'd picked up that had been instrumental to me being able to do youth ministry. And I thought that was something I could pass along to other people.
Yeah. And man, I can't agree more with that. You find I think what you see a lot of times is you have people who grow up in the church or at least come to faith during that kind of youth group period, really excited about that season of life and how God worked in them during their kind of jump into youth ministry. Some folks genuinely called into youth ministry, but they go away to school, they come away, they don't really have the skill set to manage the ministry. And a lot of times we want to over spiritualize kind of this calling of ministry, and we focus on some things maybe, but we neglect the things that are going to really support and help you do this long term and not burn out, not quit, not get fired, not get frustrated. So man, I 100% agree with that.
Yeah, I've said I have a friend who graduated from IU Kelley School of Business with a master's degree in finance. Okay, so this guy has 7 years of training in finance, and he went out and got a job in the corporate world, and he was the low man on a 5-man team whose job was to administrate this $2 million budget or whatever. He had 7 years of financial training, and he went and got a job. And with 7 years of financial training, they were not even close to trusting him with a budget. What happens when you get a youth ministry job? It's actually one of the few jobs in the world where from day one, you're typically entrusted to manage a sum of money over the course of 12 months and come out at the end, having spent that amount of money or less. And youth ministers are given extremely little training in how to do that.
Yeah, I mean, just basic things like managing money, your budget, a ministry budget, managing your time, which I know you do a lot with that as well, recruiting, managing leaders, training leaders. There's the publicity, aspect of you're trying to promote, you're planning events, you're planning a calendar. I mean, there are a lot of things and skills that are assumed for a youth pastor when they're hired, and they're not always, as a youth pastor coming into that, especially, 20 years old, you were 20, I was 18. I didn't know anything, and so you just hope you don't get fired and you figure it out along the way. And unfortunately that doesn't always happen.
Oh, absolutely. I remember my first, it was my first month. I was in charge of a fundraiser that was expected to make $4,000. And I had taken some classes in nonprofit finance, and so I understood, some of the basic principles of fundraising and things like that. But I remember thinking, man, if I showed up because I wanted to, do the things that I typically think are youth pastor things, hang out with kids, go to Taco Bell, do talks, have a dodgeball tournament. Like, I would be in over my head from day one. And I was just so thankful that I was partially equipped. I don't even think I was fully equipped with some training to do that, but I just couldn't imagine being totally unready for your first assignment.
So just real quick, and then I want to kind of move into what I really want to tackle today. But for the youth pastor, the youth worker, the volunteer who's listening, who doesn't have the business background that maybe you do, I mean, would you say, hey, that's not an excuse, right? Go find the resources that are out there. There's plenty of stuff. You need to work on those areas and those skills. And at the same time, I would also say, you don't have to be great at everything. You can bring folks alongside you who are strong in those areas, but you've got to be intentional to do so.
Yeah, I would say, I'm always amazed. There are youth pastors and pastors who have master's degrees and have spent, $70,000 or $80,000 on their education to get where they are. You can go to a community college and take a basic accounting class or a basic finance class for $250. And that will give you the foundation you need. Because you're right, you don't have to be perfect at it. You don't have to be amazing at it. You can find people to help you who are a lot smarter than you, but you've got to have that basic level. And I would say, absolutely, that not knowing one of your core responsibilities is not an excuse not to do it. There are plenty of ways and plenty of resources out there to help you learn how to do it.
Yeah, I 100% wholeheartedly agree in that. If you can't manage those types of things, it doesn't really matter how much of a heart you have for teens and parents and families, or how much you love the Lord. You're just not going to be able to sustain a ministry. And that doesn't sound really spiritual, but it's just the facts of where we are.
Yeah.
Let's change subject for just a second and talk about, you've written a lot lately, especially just about how overcommitted, and how busy this generation is. And in the last episode, in episode 7, I interviewed Steve Parr, and he's done some research on why those students who graduate from our ministries and go off and stay, those students who stay in the faith and don't, quote unquote, graduate from God, what are those things that are keeping them? One of the things that we talked about in that interview was that, parents who were involved, who were serving in the church, it was unbelievable, the percentage of how much that helped students stay in the faith for the longer haul of their life. And so we start talking about how busy they are as students and families. I mean, this is a big issue, and you've written on this quite a bit lately, especially.
Yeah, and what I'm trying to accomplish is just to help educate youth workers a little bit, maybe make us a little more empathetic, because the research that's out about teenagers right now says they are wildly overscheduled. The typical teenager experiences a longer work day than their parents do. So they're between school and homework and everything else, the amount of time that they're booked for school work is more than the amount of time their parents are booked for work. And then you throw on extracurricular activities and parental pressures and sports and all that. And so the typical response of a youth worker is to lament this, to say they've got time to play basketball and soccer and lacrosse and be in band, but they never have time to come to youth group. And I get that because I've been there, but I don't think our response should be anger or frustration or just to be upset with students. I see a lot of that because in addition to being overscheduled, they're sleeping less, almost 2 hours a night less than teenagers were 15 years ago. That's huge. And their diet is worse, partially as a byproduct of being so busy, more fast food, more vending machine food, that kind of thing. And if you talk to any doctor about what someone who is a teenager, who's hormonal, who's underslept, who's overstressed, and who's eating poorly, and is really not yet emotionally mature enough to deal with all that, a doctor will say that person's sick.
Yeah.
And what our teenagers need is love and rest. And Jesus promises that. He says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and need rest." And instead of giving students that message from Scripture, we're typically trying to get them to commit to our stuff, either in addition to everything else or to drop everything else. We've become another person pulling at their time instead of showing them the Jesus who says, "Come to me, all you who are weary, and I will give you rest."
Yeah. I mean, I think everyone listening can look around in their youth ministries and see that just in the students that we serve. They're running 100 miles an hour nonstop. And so how then do we go about doing what you're talking about? How do we come and say, hey, this is, man, the gospel is good and rich, and Jesus promises rest, not more burden?
Well, I think the first thing we got to do is we got to stop adding more burden. You know what I mean? I love youth group. I love youth ministry. But if a student tells me they can't come to Bible study and prayer group and youth group this week, I've got to be at least understanding, at least empathetic to where they're coming from, not immediately go to, I need you to do this. I need you to do this. You need to be doing this. Because those things are good. Those things are great. We should do them. But we need to be very careful that we're not adding to that burden. And so I think, some people will actually teach on priorities. I think that's great. If you're not going to teach on helping students set priorities, don't be upset when students can't set priorities.
Right.
But I think another part of it is I try to look at my calendar and I try to say, how can I pack more value into the time that I have with students? And if I have a student who says, I can't come to the Nerf war because I have homework, I need to really step back and say, is Nerf war that important? I mean, that's fellowship and there's maybe going to be some good stuff that goes on there. But I can't act like everything that I do is the most important thing that should be on their schedule. I have a student who, we've been talking about Christian colleges and stuff. And the reason he's busting his butt, in school and extracurriculars is because he knows his family can't afford for him to go to a Christian school, but his heart's set on it. And so he's really, really pushing himself to get a scholarship. And so that really puts me in do I say, school should be less important? I don't want to say that to him. I don't think I should say that to him.
Yeah, I definitely think there is a huge component that we often miss of just being not just even intentional with the time that we have them, but beyond that, even like just our schedule and considering the family in how we schedule things, and summers are crazy enough for, without anything else. And then we schedule just an insane amount of things that we're trying to get every student to. And you piggyback that with our approach typically can be more guilt and shame than we missed you.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I've said this before. If we're using guilt and shame as a strategy to get people to show up to hear our message of grace, man, we're messing up. That's not right.
Yeah. And that's, that seems to be the trump card is, man, if you really love Jesus, you'd be at church. And, like anything, there's truth to that to an extent, right? But we've got to be careful that we're not teaching kids, do this, 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 and that makes you a good Christian. And if you do this, this, and this, and this, well, then you're not a very good Christian.
Yeah, absolutely. And from a strategic standpoint, I've challenged myself to say, if I really believe that I have to have a student active in 3 different programs during the week for this to be effective, then I've probably got the wrong strategy.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you something else. This is kind of some fascinating stuff. I don't have hard numbers or research to back this up. It's all kind of anecdotal. But when you talked earlier about students holding on to their faith when they go to college, it's been my experience that students who are busier in high school actually have an easier time holding on to their faith. I like I said, I don't have numbers. I don't have hard research, but that's just what I've noticed in my own ministry. And I think one of the reasons for that is that whether or not you were busy in high school, you're going to be busy in college.
Yes.
College is a busy time. So if I have a kid who's involved in extracurricular activities in high school and still holds on to his faith, then that kid can go to college and be busy and still hold on to his faith. If I have a kid in high school who isn't involved in anything and is at youth group 3 times a week, Like we lift that up as if that's the best thing. That kid goes to college and becomes busy, and all of a sudden now he doesn't know how to handle it, and mom and dad aren't there to push him to church. Those are the kids that I've seen that tend to fall away the most.
Yeah, and I mean, by no means are we saying don't do youth activities, right? I mean, for the listeners sitting here going, oh, you're right, we should cancel all this stuff. That's not what we're saying.
No, absolutely not.
Don't go back to your pastor and say, I listened to this podcast on youth ministry and they said we should cancel all our youth group activities. That's not what we're saying. Just be intentional with the time that you do have.
Yeah, absolutely.
And at the end of the day, youth ministry is really about relationships. And you need to leverage those to the fullest in every scenario that you have. And look, some of the best ministry I've done ever in my life was when I was a bivocational youth pastor working 4 jobs in the church, and it was just in, hey, I've got to run up to Home Depot. Let me pick you up on the way. Mm-hmm. And just those conversations along the way, or, I've got to do yard work. Why don't you come over and help? And it's
that's a win-win right there.
That's a win-win. In all seriousness, like I've got help, which I need, and I'm spending time with the student.
That's my go-to trick, man.
Yeah, don't miss those opportunities, because even the busiest student, will take advantage of those opportunities when they can.
Yeah, and you mentioned that, and I just, this thought popped in my head as I'm thinking about students that I've called to help me rake leaves and stuff like that. And it's never quite clicked with me before until just now, but I have students who would much rather come rake leaves with me than come to youth group. Yes,
for sure. I've got a student who right now will not come to church. And part of it is schedule, okay? And this is actually a college student. So they're technically not in youth ministry anymore, but they graduated a few years ago. I ran into them a couple of months ago out and just said, hey, I've missed you. How are you? How's life? And we just said, let me take you. I said, hey, let me take you to lunch. What's a good day? Let's go to lunch. So we go to lunch, and the conversation was real straightforward. What can I do to help and encourage you? I was not prepared for the answer I got. I was expecting something really spiritual, like, well, just pray for me. Or he said to me, I just like to get together and hang out once a week. Oh man, I can do that, right? Mm-hmm. Come over to the house. And so that's what's been happening. Just once a week, coming and hanging out. And do I want him to come back in church and be back and plugged in and involved in church? Absolutely. Absolutely. Is there need for him to be in there? Absolutely. But he's got to come on his terms. And he's got to know that he is loved, right? And that in the end, it's not church for church's sake. And he's getting it. He's getting it. And this has only been a few weeks. And so, I had a student over the other day. I have an old Volkswagen Beetle, like a 1972 Volkswagen Beetle. And I had to pull the engine out, which is not as hard as it sounds. And I had a student here for 7 hours just helping me work on the car. Mm-hmm. Do you know how much ministry I do laying underneath my car, just talking life? It's great. And not only does just the ministry and the conversation, but those are memories that these students take with them for life. They may not remember what I taught on last week, but he'll remember working on that car with me forever.
Absolutely.
And so I think we need to take advantage of some of those as well. How do we go about then? Is there an element where we need to communicate this to parents?
Yeah, I do. I do communicate this to parents. And so I try to be filled with grace, and I try to make sure that my ministry to a student isn't so program centric that it falls apart if they're not there for 2 weeks. And so I'll tell parents, hey, lacrosse season's coming up. I know who plays lacrosse in my church, and I can email their parents just the list of people who play lacrosse, which is pretty cool. And I can say, hey, I know lacrosse season's coming up, and during lacrosse season, they in the month of March, they have Sunday morning travel practices, so they're not here. And rather than go on my crusade that lacrosse is evil and you should pull your kid out of lacrosse. What I say is, I want to have a burrito or whatever with your student this month, and I'm going to text them and set it up, and I'm going to let you know if they don't, and then you're going to set it up for me. Basically saying, I want to talk to your kid about Jesus on Sunday at youth group. And if I can't talk to your kid about Jesus on Sunday at youth group, I still want to talk to your kid about Jesus.
Yeah.
What that does is that makes the Jesus part more important than the program part.
Yeah, and I think, again, it's just, you got to pursue like crazy. This idea of this passive youth group thing where I'm just going to program it and they're going to come is ridiculous and not effective.
Yeah, I agree. And then the other thing that I do is I dig. I dig at what I'm too busy actually means. I would say 2/3 of the time, I'm too busy is a vanilla excuse that covers something else. Either because they just don't like youth group and they don't want to tell me that to my face, so they say I'm really busy with school, or because it's covering something else they don't want to share. And I had a student who, after months and months of me trying to get him to come, finally told me that he's in counseling because he has pretty significant social anxiety. And we're a large youth group. We have over 100 people here most of the time. And so if you have social anxiety, the idea of coming to a place with music and people running around and there's over 100 people, he's terrified to come. Not because he doesn't like Jesus, not because he doesn't like me, not because he doesn't dislike people individually. Crowds scare him. And I got the I'm too busy line for months until I finally actually tried to listen to figure out what was really going on. And I think that's an important step too. Often we'll find I'm not coming to youth group because I was dating that other girl from youth group and we broke up and it's really awkward now. And is that a good enough reason? I don't know, but that's a kid who needs a mentor, who needs some support in his life either way. And so dig and find out what's going on, and don't give up on a kid just because they're not at your program. Your ministry to students is not dependent on them attending your program.
Yeah, I think what you're describing is going after the heart and not after the action. And too often we go after the action and forget that the heart drives the action.
Yeah, I would say it's easier. It's easy sometimes to value a student's attendance more than you value the student.
Yes. Well, yeah, because you all want numbers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean, I've written about that. Why your numbers matter and why they don't matter. Because they do matter to a point, but not maybe as much as you think. And we've got to be really careful how we define success in our ministries. And oftentimes, if you find in your ministry that there is an overemphasis on numbers in your student ministry, it's probably because when people ask you how things are going, the first thing you do is tell them how many kids you had, which you're training people that numbers are what defines success. I mean, I had a conversation 2 weeks ago with an adult in our church, and they gave me the line, well-meaning, well-intended, but if just one student comes to Christ, it's worth it. And I challenged him back and said, I don't think so. I think if we're obedient and no one comes to Christ, it was worth it, because God calls us to obedience first. And you don't have to look much further than the prophet Jeremiah to see that lived out in Scripture. So I think you're so right in that attendance is great. Do we want them all there? Yeah, sure we do. But it can't be the most important thing. I think, have you noticed, this is maybe kind of along those lines, like, it seems like I'm noticing more and more students with some of those anxieties.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it's all, I think you can draw a direct line between depression rates, social anxiety, seasonal anxiety, any kind of a disorder that ends in anxiety disorder. You can draw a straight line between those and the fact that teenagers are chronically underslept.
What you're saying is we should not do lock-ins anymore.
Well, I've been saying that for a lot of time, and for a lot of different reasons besides that.
Yeah.
But that's another talk.
I'll take your reason.
Okay.
I'll actually take any reason, but I'll take that one.
Maybe I should write a blog post, the top 20 reasons why you shouldn't do lock-ins, because I could come up with 20 pretty quickly.
I think most of us who have been in ministry for a little while could probably do that. I had a conversation not too long ago at one of our youth pastor network meetings about lock-ins, and one of the guys said, "Man, when I get to heaven, I'm going to punch the guy that invented the lock-in in the mouth." And the other guys standing there said, "Oh, you don't have to worry. He's not going to be in heaven."
Yeah.
You know?
No. So have you ever done a lock-in and gotten to the end of like the all-nighter? Have you ever gotten to the end of an all-nighter when students were leaving and seen a student leave happy?
No.
I've never seen a student leave a lock-in happy.
No.
I have more kids who came to a lock-in, had a great time. At 1 a.m. they were having a great time. And by the time their parents came to pick them up, they're like, "I'm never coming back here again. This was horrible."
But then 2 weeks later, they want to have another lock-in.
Yep.
Yeah. I hate them, man. I hate them. But that's neither here nor there. Jesus uses them. I know he does, and he has. But I don't like them. I don't like them. So if you were going to say to somebody listening, like if you're going to just kind of bare bones, like you've got students that are overcommitted, they're underslept, they're eating poorly, it's not good and healthy for them. If you were going to say, hey, here's a few things just to be mindful of or things that you need to be communicating, what would those be?
I would be mindful of the fact that all those things that they're overcommitted to, every one of those leaders wants them to be more committed to their thing. Their band teacher wants them to practice more. Their basketball coach wants them to train more. Their physics teacher wants them to study more. And all three of those people are already pulling on that kid's arms. And I could be wrong on this, Jody, but I don't know that I see Jesus walking into that and just pulling on the kid more. I just don't see it happening that way, that instead of just trying to violently pull them and make them quit everything, that we should open up with love and peace and let that attract them. I also think that we need to keep in mind that busy students have really busy parents. That kid that is involved in all those activities, someone else is managing his schedule. He's not managing his own calendar. Mom is in charge of managing the calendar. Mom and dad are in charge of driving him everywhere. And so you're also, fighting that when you say, hey, Wednesday night, I know there's no practice. Why don't you come to this thing? And you're saying, this is the one free night that this family has. And there's a temptation to fill it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but having grace for those parents too would be a great first step. And theologically, it kind of goes back to what I mentioned earlier, which is we have a message of grace to share, and let's not use guilt as a tool to share our message of grace.
Yeah, and I think for us, one of the things that we try to do is we try to communicate really, really intentionally to the parents of the importance of kind of helping establish boundaries and priorities for their family and for their students. My oldest right now, is in middle school. I get it. Like, I'm feeling that. Everybody wants you to do everything. And because all of her friends are doing everything, she also wants to be at everything, right? And so those are conversations that we are just consistently having to have, saying, listen, you can't do everything. You don't have to do everything. That's okay. Like, pick a few things that you're really going to enjoy, and let's give those your all, and do your very best in the things that you can do. And so I think just encouraging parents in that, like, help set those priorities, help set those boundaries for you, for them, for their families, is really important. But not just coming and guilting them and saying, you're so busy, your kids can't come to church. I think the message needs to be, Jesus needs to be the center of your home. And whatever that looks like in your home, that's what it needs to look like. And, if you're running 5 million directions and you're never speaking or talking about the gospel, in the end, it's not really going to help. And so you can do all those things, but at the end of the day, you got to shepherd your kid's heart. And that doesn't necessarily always look like coming to church every time the door's open, but it takes on the parents' part just some confidence and some intentionality as well, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And, if I had a family that, maybe on Wednesday nights that, they were busy. Everyone's busy, but on Wednesday nights, they always read scripture together and prayed together and ate together. I wouldn't push them to do anything else on Wednesday nights. That's exactly what they should be doing.
And I think a lot of times the approach that we take to guilt students into not being there bleeds over into the home and the parents. And in the end, it just drives them away even more, right? Because now they just feel guilty because they're not at church, and they feel shame because they're not really discipling their family. They're not really steering that. And instead of coming alongside and being able to be an encouragement to them, we just cover them up with guilt and shame.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think now at the same time, if you never see a student, that's a problem. If they're not coming to anything ever, and the family just kind of, you need to be aware, I think like you're saying, even with lacrosse stuff, be aware of those seasons of life that seem to get busier. And when those end, you got to chase those kids like crazy, because the habit of not being there can really set in and become, a problem.
Yeah, but like I said earlier, if I never see a student, then too busy isn't the real reason.
Absolutely. That's where, again, relationships have to be so key. And I think the pressure doesn't need to be, for the youth pastor, for the youth worker, don't feel the pressure that you have to be that for every student. That's why you pull other folks around you.
Yeah, and the first step that I challenge people, the pursuit of perfection is what paralyzes us sometimes. We look at our list and there's 30 kids, and how will I ever have time to talk one-on-one with these 30 kids? And you don't have to. You look at that list of 30 kids, you pray about that list of 30 kids, and you say, God, which one are you going to lay on my heart this week? And then you go after that one, and you repeat it the next week. So you're not looking at it saying, man, there's so many kids that aren't here. There's no way I could ever meet with them all. You're just saying, there's so many kids that aren't here. How can I meet with one of them this week and find out what's going on?
And sometimes it's a simple text message. Sometimes it's just a, hey, I'm thinking about you and praying for you today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this student I mentioned earlier with the social anxiety, we all have these students who, for whatever, he hadn't been here for about 3 months. He's not the only student who hadn't been here for 3 months, but for whatever reason, this was the kid that kind of haunted me. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That God was just laying this kid on my heart, and not to say that I don't value the other ones or that God doesn't value the other ones, but this is the one that God was laying on me. And so he was the one that now I'm meeting with him, once a week, and hopefully trying to get him a little more comfortable and generate some ideas of how we can get him involved in a program that's not gonna freak him out. But I think, and I wrote this in a blog post, I think God lays those students on our hearts all the time. And I think pretty much everyone listening to this can think of, that one student who just kind of haunts you. And God lays that in our hearts, and we feel that and we interpret it clearly, but we sometimes screw up our next step, which is when God lays a student on my heart, God's not saying, hey, Aaron, I'm really laying the student on your heart so you can invite him to a program. I try to think of it as God's laying the student on my heart so that I can go be in relationship with him. That's my next step when God convicts me that way.
I think we've all been there. We've all been there. And don't feel, and I think like you're saying, don't feel so burdened to reach everybody that you in turn reach no one.
Mm-hmm.
So, you can't sacrifice be a youth pastor to somebody, right? And
yeah, that's a great line. Be a youth pastor to somebody.
Because I've seen it, and I've been there in seasons of my life where I'm so stressed and so worried about, I don't want to be seen like I'm playing favorites, or I don't want to, and in the end of that, I kind of look back and go, gosh, what have I really done? Like, I've invested in no one.
Mm-hmm.
I've just invested in no one for the sake of trying to invest in everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And you just can't do that. Well, cool, man. I know you've written a bunch about this. We'll put some links to some of those, to a couple of those posts here in the show notes for folks to grab. And I know also on your blog I know you've got the Essential Time Management course, which is great.
Yeah, it's been really cool. We try to teach youth pastors how to manage their time better. That's one of those skills that we don't have, and it leads to burnout and a dozen other problems. So,
yeah, I think if somebody just sat down and really honestly logged their time and how they spend it, they would find that they're not really as busy as they think.
Yeah, either they're not really as busy as they think, or they're busy on things that don't matter.
Yeah. Yeah. So for all the talk and the guilt and the shame that we throw at students and parents for busyness, we seem to forget that we are also guilty of those things. That if we weren't, I mean, let's be honest, if we weren't youth pastor, youth worker being paid or in charge of being at all those events, we probably wouldn't be at all of them either.
Oh, absolutely not. Yeah, that's always been a convicting thought for me, and that's always kind of that question that I ask is, if you were a volunteer or you were a student, would you go to all three of these things every week?
Yeah.
Probably not.
Probably not. So folks, how about this? Is there a resource out there that you would throw out to just recommend for ministry wise for those listening?
Well, I would obviously recommend the time management course that we just mentioned. But because I don't want to be that guy that plugs myself, I'm going to go ahead and recommend a book.
Okay.
And the book is called Play It Away by Charlie Hohen, Hoehn. And Charlie Hohen is not, to my knowledge, a Christian, although he seems to be friendly to Christians, and he might be. And it's not a Christian book, but Charlie Hohen is a guy who was like a Silicon Valley young stud out of college, brilliant genius who wanted to go make his millions and just suffered burnout. I mean, just some pretty terrible burnout stuff happened to him, and it got serious. And he talks about in the book, how he developed some anxiety and some depression, all related to his burnout. And there's some incredible similarities actually between youth pastors and people who work in Silicon Valley. Meaning that often these are people who are very young, right out of college or often still in college, who are incredibly ambitious and believe they can change the world. And that similarity causes us to work in similar ways. You read stories about these guys out in Cali who, sleep in their offices and work too late and are up early and doing the same thing that youth pastors do. And so he outlines basically the steps that he took to overcome his burnout, getting his diet under control, getting his sleep under control, managing his stress. And these are all things I would absolutely recommend that any youth worker who's on a burnout path should read this book. Yeah,
and even if you feel like you're not, read the book because you probably are. You just don't recognize it.
This is a book that if you're not there, then you should read it and you should keep it on your bookcase, because if you're a youth worker and you're not at burnout right now, there's like an 87% chance, I think, that you're going to get there at some point.
Wayne Cordero has written a book called Leading on Empty. I don't know.
Yes.
So good. It's another book that I recommend along those same lines. And just, it's a big issue, man. It's a huge issue.
No, I typically recommend both of those books. If you would have given me two, that's the one I would have chosen.
Yeah, it's so good. Both of them.
Yeah, Wayne Cordero nails the spiritual stuff, and Charlie Hohen really nails the other stuff really well. I mean, they just play really well together. I think they should be required reading for youth workers.
Yeah, I think they should be required reading for everybody. I mean, because, and here's the thing too, like, you may be the youth pastor, you may be listening, you may be the youth pastor, and you've got volunteers working for you. They can totally experience the same burnout.
Oh, they do. And we typically don't do a good enough job of protecting and shepherding our volunteers. Where youth ministry is unfortunately embraced a volunteer model of use them up and spit them out, which is heartbreaking.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times folks come in serving in our ministries, they're really excited, but they kind of get in there and then there's no way out.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they didn't know they were committing for life.
Yeah.
And so then there's this, again, back to this guilt and shame thing of leaving and abandoning these youth and these students. And so we can burn them out just as quickly as well.
Yeah. So I think if we could summarize everything that we've said so far, we would say guilt and shame is a tool that we should remove from our arsenal.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Man, if folks want to find you and connect with you more, where would they go?
The blog is smarteryouthministry.com, and my name is Aaron Helman, and you can find me there on the Twitter machine.
Well, cool, man. Thanks for coming on the show today. I appreciate it. Really good stuff and things we definitely need to be mindful of, I think, especially going forward, because it's not slowing down.
It's not going to.
It's just getting worse. And so, man, those listening, head over to smarteryouthministry.com. I highly recommend that. I always appreciate it, man, because so much of your stuff that you put out is so fact-driven. You really put the time in to do the research. You're not just kind of, I mean, you put a lot of time into those posts, and it shows, and I appreciate that very much.
Well, thank you.
So head on over there. Thanks, Aaron. I appreciate it, man. Thanks for coming on.
All right, you're welcome.
And we'll catch you later, man.
All right.
And there you have it. That's that. A great interview with Aaron. Again, I would highly recommend you head over to smarteryouthministry.com. Check out all that he has going on over there. Again, the show notes will have all the links and resources that we talked about and mentioned in the interview there, and you can find those at thelongerhaul.com/episode 008. And then one final plea, if you're enjoying the show, head over to iTunes, subscribe, and leave a review there. Man, I would really appreciate that so very, very much. And that'll do it. That'll put it in the books. Thanks for listening again. We'll see you in the next episode. Until then, give them Jesus.
Thanks for listening to the Longer Haul Youth Ministry Podcast at www.thelongerhaul.com.